with me if it goes off like it just did. Right, Shelley was born. Remember, when we're talking about writers, normally we refer to just their surname. So Shakespeare, Dickens, in this case, Shelley, which is a relief, isn't it? Because it's quite a mouthful, Percy Bysshe Shelley. So he was born into the what you'd call the establishment. By that, we mean he was born into a fairly wealthy and powerful family, and he would have expected to have a wealthy and successful life himself. He wouldn't have been mixing with the likes of me. I won't speak for you, but he would have mixed in high circles. So, for example, this is a picture of the school he went to, Eton, which these days is probably considered one of the most important or most popular, or anyway, it's considered a significant private school where lots of wealthy and famous people go, and lots of politicians go there. So he's part of that establishment. From there he went to Oxford University, which is still one of the most famous universities in the world. So this is a young man who came from a wealthy and powerful family who was expected to follow in his family's footsteps and become wealthy and powerful himself. But he was a bit of a rebel. He didn't follow that path. While he was at Oxford, he published a pamphlet on atheism, so kind of a criticism of God, criticising those who believed in God, which obviously at the time, at the start of the early 1800s, was highly controversial in a very, very religious age. So he was controversial. He was a bit of a rebel. He wasn't scared to speak up on his own views. He also, when he was a bit older, he ran away with a 16-year-old girl, which in those days, people did tend to marry a bit younger, but still a bit controversial. So this is somebody who didn't necessarily stick to the rules, didn't worry too much about what other people thought of him. And he lived a very short life, very short life. He died at the age of 30 in a sailing accident, but by which time he'd written a lot of poetry, and much of which is still read and still quite famous these days, and studied at universities and schools. So a short and rebellious and very eventful life. He was married to Mary Wollstonecraft eventually, not the 16-year-old girl. After that failed, then he married Mary Wollstonecraft. This lovely picture here. She's well known as the wife of Shelley, but also the writer of Frankenstein. If we move over to this picture here, shortly before Shelley, I've said he was a bit of a rebel. One of the influences that might have made him a rebel was this. This is the French Revolution. This happened just before he was born. It happened in 1789. And in the French Revolution, the people rose up and got rid of their monarchy. So got rid of the kings and the queens and the lords and the ladies that had run the country for many, many years, and they became a republic, which basically means they elected other people to run the country instead of royalty. So the French Revolution was supposed to be about putting power and control back in the hands of the everyday people. So Shelley himself was no great respecter of authority or royalty. You could say he was an anti-establishment figure, so he disliked those in power and those who abused their power. So that could be one of the influences behind his thinking and behind his kind of rebellious role. If we move over here, this is obviously the pyramids in Egypt. Now, at the time Shelley was growing up, and at the time he was writing poetry, there was a lot of interest in Britain, in Egyptian culture. Explorers had been to Egypt and discovered relics from the Egyptian tombs, and they brought them back, and they were on display in the British Museum. So we don't know whether Shelley himself saw relics that had been brought back, things like mummies and models and clay pots, things like that. We don't know whether he himself saw uh, any exhibits from the pharaoh's tombs, from the pyramids, but we do know that at that particular time, and he was studying Oxford, so he would have studied classic civilizations, and there would have been a lot of interest in ancient Egypt culture and history. So two influences so far: the French Revolution and also an interest in Egyptian culture and history. And finally, if we go up to this man here, just having a little rest by a waterfall. Shelley grew up in what is known as the Romantic movement. Now, when we talk about movements, we're talking about when a group of artists or writers come together and write or paint at the same time and share similar views or similar ideas about art and society. So Shelley was part of the Romantic movement. Other famous writers you may or may not heard of, we'll be studying poems by them, are William Wordsworth and William Blake. They were also part of the Romantic movement. So what did they believe in? Well, firstly, they were growing up at the start of the Industrial Revolution. We've looked at the impact that had on A Christmas Carol. And remember also Arthur Burling was somebody that made huge amounts of money from industry towards the end of the Industrial Revolution. But Shelley lived really right at the start of the Industrial Revolution, where people were starting to move to the cities and where people were finding employment in factories, and those big chimneys started to puff all that poisonous toxins and smoke into the atmosphere. And at the same time, science, people were starting to believe in science, which was starting to challenge some religious beliefs. So the Romantics kind of rejected these advances in society, the Industrial Revolution, the belief in science rather than religion. They thought that the changes that were happening to society made people a bit oppressed, that they made them controlled either by government or, for example, everyone had to go and work in factories and do the same job. So they thought it was kind of killing the human spirit a bit. They believed that human beings should be mainly emotional creatures, and that they should be powered by their imaginations, and that things like jobs in factories and having to be stuck indoors and being controlled by royals or politicians crushed the human spirits. They believed that humans' imagination should be free to roam wherever they wished, and because of this they had a strong association with nature. They associated nature with freedom for human beings. For nature for them was somewhere where you got away from all the things that controlled and oppressed human beings. And they believe that nature really, and this becomes important when we look at some other Romantic poems, but they believe that nature could really develop the human brain and human emotions, that nature could have a powerful and transformative effect on humans. So that's the kind of contextual background. That's his life, and that's the major influences on his life and this poem. So I've got some questions for you now. So pens ready, or you can type them. But either way, if you could answer these questions in full sentences and then send them back to me by email, or take a picture of the answers you've written in your book. So the questions. I have said at the start of the video, about 2 minutes in, that Shelley was a bit of a rebel. Can you tell me two of the ways in which he rebelled against society or against the way that he would have been expected to behave? And number two. Where is number two? What event that happened before Shelley's birth might have influenced his rebellious nature? And remember, rebellious means to go against society's rules and to go against what's expected. So what event that happened before his birth might have helped to create this fairly rebellious character. Question 3. What artistic movement did Shelley belong to? And to help you out, other writers that were part of that movement were William Wordsworth and William Blake. So what was the name of the movement? And finally, number 4, once you've got the answer to number 3, the name of the movement, what sort of things did this group of artists and writers believe in? What did they believe about nature? What did they believe about the way society was going at the time? And what did they believe about human nature? So if you could write down your answers to those and send me in. And next we shall start by having a look at the poem. Except I'm going to pause for now and go and put the kettle on. Hello again. I've had my cup of tea. I hope you had one too, or maybe a hot chocolate. I'll put my jumper on because it's absolutely freezing today after all the lovely weather we've had, and all ready to start on the actual poem. So a little bit of information you'll need to know. The poem is called Ozymandias, and remember the poet's name is Percy Bysshe Shelley, but we refer to writers by their surname. Ozymandias is, or was, the Greek name for a pharaoh. So the subject of the poem is a pharaoh. This pharaoh was called Ramesses II, an actual pharaoh. So the statue that the traveller finds in the desert is actually a statue of a pharaoh. But Shelley uses the Greek name for Ramesses, which is Ozymandias. So, to start with, this is the poem is a frame narrative. That's something we've not come across before, I don't think. So, a frame narrative is a story within a story. So, Shelley, the poet, is telling the story, but within his story is a story that was told to him. So he meets a traveller, the traveller tells him a story, and then this poem is Shelley telling the story that he was told by the traveller. I hope that makes sense. A frame narrative, a story within a story. So he starts off, and this is the only bit of the poem that isn't the traveller's story. He starts off by telling us that he met the traveller. So, I met a traveller from an antique land. So this is Shelley, or the persona, talking. The antique land means somewhere historic. We'll assume it's Egypt, as it's based on the statue he found is an Egyptian pharaoh. So we'll assume the traveller had been travelling in Egypt. We don't know to be sure, but the fact that it says an antique land creates a bit of intrigue and a bit of mystery, because obviously Egypt and the pyramids did create an impression of mystery. There was still a lot, and still is a lot, unknown about why the Egyptians built the pyramids and how many they built, and there's still a lot of mystery and curiosity about their culture. So describing it as an antique land kind of creates a bit of mystery and intrigue for the reader. And then Shelley, on the next line, Shelley says, who said? I met a traveller from an antique land who says, and then you'll see the speech marks. So Shelley, from here on in, is just reporting what the traveller told him about his experiences. And the traveller starts by describing the statue that he found. So 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone. So the traveller found in the middle of the desert 2 huge legs. No other part of the body that had fallen down. So this is a ruined statue. So just two legs stuck in the middle of the desert. And the adjective vast tells you the scale of the statue. This was a pretty big statue. On the next line, he describes the location of the statue. It said they stand in the desert. So they're still upright. So it's a bit of a weird image, really, isn't it? So you've got all of that sand. If you can imagine a picture of the desert, a sand stretching as far away as you can see. And then in the middle of that, two stone legs sticking up, huge stone legs sticking up out of the sand. So it's a bit of a weird image, but that's kind of the point. If you think about the difficulty of getting that stone out to the desert and putting that stone in the desert, building a massive statue in the desert, it would seem like a pretty foolish thing to do. Firstly, who's going to see it? Secondly, it's almost impossible to actually get it there in the desert. And thirdly, you get pretty big storms in the desert, don't you? So it's obviously going to get weather beaten over the years. Then Shelley uses some ellipsis. So he stands in the desert, the ellipsis creates a pause, but more importantly, it separates the description of the legs from the description of the rest of the body, or most of the rest of the body, which is lying in ruins around the statue. So the legs are still standing up, but the rest of the statue is in ruins, lying around the statue in the middle of the desert. So he describes near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. The shattered visage is the face of the statue, and he says it's half sunk. So it's kind of sticking up out of the sand in the desert. So the ellipsis is there to separate the description of the legs, which are still standing, from the description of the face, which is half buried in the sand. And he describes what the face looks like. He says, the face whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. So let's have a look at that description there. So there's a frown, a wrinkled lip, and a sneer of cold command on the face of the statue. So this suggests a character who is very serious. Cold command suggests somebody that is arrogant and maybe feels a bit superior to other people. And of course the statue is of a pharaoh, so they would feel superior, and they would have been superior. But cold command suggests somebody that is unemotional, arrogant, and superior. I forgot. I should have had questions on the first 4 lines. So let's pause now, and I'd like you to answer these 4 questions, please. Again, either by email, or if you want to write them in your books and take a picture and send me them. So bear with me. I have the questions on the other side of the page, which you can't see, and the answers, which you can't see either. So, can you tell me, please, which pharaoh is this poem based on? What was the name of the Egyptian pharaoh this poem was based on? Number 2. At the start of this section, about 12 to 13 minutes in, I explained that the poem is a frame narrative. Can you tell me what a frame narrative is, please? Number 3. The poem describes the remains of a statue found in the desert. Who found the statue? And number 4. What is the only part of the statue that is still standing, still upright? Time for a pause, cup of tea, bit of cake, a few Haribos, and we'll carry on with the rest of the poem and some more questions.